The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Testimony continued this week at the inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act to clear the convoy protest earlier this year. Tonight, columnist Susan Delacourt is with us on what those hearings say about the state of dissent in Canada today. Then our Ontario hubs reflect on what happened in this week's municipal elections. And from troubles in Canadian federalism to evaluating Finfluencers, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, October 28th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. When the convoy protest rolled into downtown Ottawa in February of this year, no one could have predicted what was to come. Or could they? Testimony this week continued to reveal a very mixed picture of what officials knew and what they could have done about it. With us now for her take on the bigger picture of what the hearings tell us about protest and dissent in Canada. From the nation's capital, Susan Delacourt, national columnist for the Toronto Star. Hi, Susan. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
So help us understand this. What's the purpose of this public inquiry?
Well, technically, the purpose is quite limited. It's to find out whether, to determine whether the Prime Minister and Justin Trudeau and his government were correct to invoke the Emergencies Act on February 14th, Valentine's Day this year, in a bid to end the convoy protest here in Ottawa. That is, they don't have a choice on whether they have this inquiry or not. It's when you invoke this law, you have to set up an inquiry. I'm more intrigued by the unofficial role of this convoy inquiry, which is to find out what the heck it was. What was this thing that landed in Ottawa and at border points across the country last winter and managed to paralyze us?
Well, this was the first time that the Emergencies Act was used, February 14th, you said, and I think by February 23rd, it was rescinded?
Yeah, even sooner, I think, yeah.
So, you know, it's the first time it's happened in this country, but for those who might not be familiar with this process, what are some of the public inquiries in Canada's recent past?
Oh, well, you know, I guess the Gomery inquiry into sponsorship spending in Quebec is the one that we all remember here in Quebec. There have been, you know, ones into the integrity of the blood system. I think everybody is comparing this one a little bit to the Gomery inquiry because of all the high, you know, I think people will remember that Jean Chrétien testified at that one. And this one, for political drama and political players, has a lot. It has a lot of people. It has one significant person who is not showing up in the form of Premier Doug Ford, too, which is added to the intrigue.
That might change. Could that possibly change?
Well, everything changes in politics. I'm finding it stunning that he is not appearing and inviting comparisons to, you know, everybody from Donald Trump to whatever. I know in the legislature this week, they were talking about the fact that Mike Harris went to the Walkerton inquiry, for example, and Premier Ford is staying away from this one. It is a strange decision.
Well, Doug Ford has been known to say, you know, the buck stops with me. And he's always, he's taken a lot of pride in being accessible to the public. What would you say is unique about the situation that he's saying that he doesn't want to appear in front of the inquiry? Or is it because that this is the first time that the Emergencies Act was used?
I find the strangest part about him not appearing is the very public support he gave to the calling of the Emergency Act. We'll note he called his own emergency in Ontario, which had limited effect. And he stood last week in Ottawa at a press conference with the Prime Minister and said he stood shoulder to shoulder with Justin Trudeau in that. Subsequent testimony, though, has revealed that it was very hard to get Ontario to participate in these tripartite city, provincial, federal meetings on ending the convoy protest. There were conflicting messages coming from the OPP about what kind of resources that the province's attorney general had promised. So it seems that there were two Doug Fords almost dealing with this very publicly. He's saying, yeah, I was really big in favor of this. This had to end. This was unacceptable. But he is digging in his heels about appearing at this inquiry and explaining this disconnect too. It looked like he was very happy to let the Prime Minister end this thing or Ottawa Police Services, but not get anywhere near it. Well, remember, he didn't come up to Ottawa during the convoy either.
Trudeau agreed to testify, and we've spoken a bit about who else is going to be, who has already testified, but help us understand, who are the people questioning the witnesses?
They are lawyers for the various people who have standing in here. So there's a lawyer for former Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly. There is a lawyer to represent a coalition of downtown Ottawa residents and businesses who were traumatized by this thing. Paul Champ, he's been very interesting. There's lawyers for the federal government. I've lost count by how many lawyers there are, but it's so what happens is a witness will get up. They're doing this. There's a particular order to this too. The way they're doing it, they're starting very local and they're expanding it. So first we got a whole, microscopic focus on Ottawa, the convoy, and it seems in the later part of this week we're now moving to the border points, to the protests and blockades that we saw at the Ambassador Bridge, for example, and one in Alberta. And I think it eventually will go national, and that's when we'll get the federal cabinet ministers here. So I would, they seem to be sort of building up. I think one other element to this that we are really watching to see, and we're starting to get hints of it, was there an international dimension to this too? We all watched on American television during the convoy. There were certain political figures on the right seeing connections between Trump's America and this freedom convoy and cheering it on Fox News. So was there an international element to this protest too? I think that's a lot of people like me are very curious about that.
And I'm guessing, too, a unique aspect of this inquiry is that we're seeing it happen in real time. If you're on Twitter, I'm following so many different journalists. It's on Twitter. We're talking about it in the news. Does that make it unique, too?
A little bit. I think we're accustomed to this now, that, this thing unfolding in real time. I think what's been mostly good about it is it's political, certainly, but it's not partisan. We're not seeing partisan divides at this thing, and I find that interesting. You're not seeing conservatives versus liberals trying to take shots at each other inside the inquiry or even outside. It's not playing as a partisan thing. There is lots of politics, or there are lots of politics, to be sure. That I, even as a resident of Ottawa, I'm just struck by the dysfunction in this city that we have seen. We just had an election this week too, and many of the issues that are playing out in this hearing, how well the city council got along, dysfunction on the police board. A lot of those issues were issues in the election, and certainly they played out here too.
Well, you used dysfunction to describe the city of Ottawa. I have a quote here from Ottawa's outgoing mayor, Jim Watson, and during the first week of the inquiry, admitted that the government lost control over the occupation and failed to protect the citizens. This is the quote. There was no question, when you look back in hindsight, at what happened. There were several failure points along the way, whether it was the city, provincial, or federal governments. We all have to take responsibility for the fact that we did not act fast enough and that the people of Ottawa suffered the most as a result of the fact that we did not clean up the occupation for 3 weeks. That's part of his testimony. What do you make of Watson's statement?
Well, as somebody who lived here through the convoy, I'd say that it feels like a bit like an understatement. It was incredible this thing went on as long as it did. And we know that it was attracting international notice too, not just from people who were cheering on the convoy, but from a few months ago, the American ambassador, Ambassador Cohen, came to the editorial board of the Toronto Star, and he said that Joe Biden's government was very grateful that the Trudeau government brought in the Emergencies Act. I think this was dysfunction on a high level. And as I said, I want to know what this thing was so that I have some kind of idea that it won't happen again. Because it did seem, everybody, I wrote last week, everybody's run out of words to describe how unprecedented this was. We've never seen anything like this before. It's the largest police operation. Every word is sort of they're tripping over themselves, finding ways to describe how large and unexpected it was. And it took everybody by surprise. I hope that we don't see another thing like this, but I certainly hope that there are lessons from this about avoiding it.
Being in Toronto and seeing what was unfolding in Ottawa, for me, I realized I had so much ignorance around how the police operated. And I saw a lot of commentary in the past few weeks of what it was really like to be in Ottawa from people who were not living in Ottawa. So having lived through it, what was it like to go through that?
It's funny, a boss of mine came to town last week, and we had, I don't know if non-Ottawa people know the Westin Hotel. We had breakfast at the Westin, and it has a gorgeous view of the city and sort of Parliament Hill and all of that. So he said, "Show me where the convoy was." And I said, "Everywhere, everywhere." It was huge. You could not get through downtown. It was frightening. There have been allusions to this, that particularly the corner of Rideau and Sussex, which is a major corner for non-Ottawa people. It's very near the Chateau Laurier. And that was a bit of a scary zone during and there have been references to this in the testimony too, that there was a criminal element operating there, and it was the most intimidating part. And for anybody in Ottawa to have, it felt, and it was officially an occupation. But, I think it's very hard for non-Ottawa people to imagine, but it was like the city was under siege for 3 weeks.
The city itself is still recovering, and I don't mean this question to come off as being disrespectful or unfeeling. It's been months since the Freedom Convoy and the Emergencies Act took place. Why should people care about this public inquiry?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because first of all, it didn't just happen to Ottawa. It happened to it was a national, I believe it was an emergency. It was a protest that frightened a lot of us because it bore some resemblance, if not an inspiration, with, maybe we'll find out, more direct links between the kind of thing we saw on January 6th in the United States, January 6th, 2021, the siege on Capitol Hill. This felt like it was one in slow motion. I think it matters in that, the way you framed this at the very beginning. I think we've seen a different kind of protest in Canada. We've seen a certain disrespect for the law, a sort of a flouting of normal rules of political discourse. And I think that's not limited to this convoy. We saw hints of it during the federal election campaign. And I don't know that that's gone away. So I really hope that this inquiry answers what is it that we were dealing with last February, not just in Ottawa, but at border points, and how vulnerable is this country to that kind of, I'd go beyond calling it mischief, into something, anarchy that reigned here for a while.
I want to read a quote from a piece that you wrote for the Toronto Star about the inquiry, and it offers what you say is a chance of reckoning for Canadians. You wrote, "This has the potential to be far more than what the government did wrong inquiry, as so many commissions are. The story here goes beyond what Trudeau and his government needed to do to contain the convoy, though that's a worthy goal in itself. This is a chance for Canadians to look at how deeply the country was shaken by 2 years of COVID and how vulnerable or naive Canada is to believe it was insulated from dysfunction rattling through other institutions at home and abroad. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to say. Is I think we've all seen. I think I described it in one of the articles I wrote during the convoy here. It felt like a national nervous breakdown. It felt, if you lived in Ottawa, that this was all the pent-up frustration of COVID on either side, and seeing how much it has damaged the country, the psyche of the country, I guess. And also, as I said, I'm worried that our institutions, police, governments, are vulnerable if people set out to cause mayhem, that we're too trusting. I think it's such an Ottawa story that the police expected the convoy protesters to park out at a site on Coventry Road and take shuttle buses to Parliament Hill. That it seemed to be, that is such a bureaucratic and very nice, typically nice Canadian way of seeing what happened here. Nobody was going to be taking shuttle buses to Parliament Hill. They were taking hot tubs to Parliament Hill. So I think, yes, we should shake ourselves out of any complacency about this. And well, we don't have to stop being nice. Maybe we should stop being naive, that we aren't vulnerable to this kind of thing.
You said that this damaged the psyche of Canadians because amongst my friend group, there was a lot of division between people who were supporting the so-called Freedom Convoy and people who were just in shock to the level of what was happening in Ottawa. We've mentioned a few times that the Emergency Act was unprecedented in Canadian history. Looking back at it now, how did it shape our understanding of dissent and protest in this country?
I think it showed us that that there aren't rules anymore. That it's been, again, almost endearing to hear the police testifying. Well, we are a city that has rules about protest, and we have a Charter of Rights, and it shows you that if somebody decides those things don't matter, we just sort of throw up our hands. And I think what was a bit heartening for me in this was that the police have had this on their radar. There's something they call the Hendon Report, and police have been keeping all levels, and security and defense, and have been keeping on top of a growing change in the shape of protest, and whether it's veering into illegal and criminal activity. And I would kill to have this Hendon Report delivered to my email every week, as many police people are apparently. But we're seeing in this thing called the Hendon Report that this has been on the radar of police for a while, that protests and blockades have become increasingly vexing to authority, and it's something we can't afford to ignore.
I want to seek in two more questions before our time is up. But you said that what you're seeing right now unfolding with the inquiry, it's nonpartisan, which is so great to see because we've seen how polarized everything has become. Do you think that what happened in Ottawa impacted more on how we look at our leaders or more about how we view the police?
I think for now, this is going to be about the police, but it's early days. We're only 2 weeks into this inquiry, and there's at least 3 or 4 more weeks left. I think it's going to move to a political level. I think it is going to get partisan because we did see the Conservatives, notably the new Conservative leaders, supporting this convoy. I don't know whether that's going to become awkward for them the more we learn about what it was. But I think we're not going to be able to keep politics out of this forever, I'm sorry to say. But I think that it's going to move away from a story of police into a story of politics.
What would happen if the commission found that the government should not have invoked the Emergencies Act?
It's an interesting question. Nothing, because you can't change the past. I guess it will be a guide for future governments if, that this did not meet the test. Because we've only used it once before, I guess we're setting the parameters by which it is used, and this inquiry will be useful for that. So I guess a guide for the future, but it's not like the Prime Minister is going to be sent to jail for using it or anything. And I'm not even sure that the public is going to have a judgment on this either way. I think, by and large, all the public opinion I've seen says this thing just had to be ended, and if it took the Emergency Act, it took the Emergency Act. I'm glad we're having these hearings, though. I'm really glad we're having them.
So what comes next?
Oh, day by day. We just, if you're like me, just riveted to it. It's as I said, it's going to get wider and wider in scope. And I would keep an eye open, and I think people who are curious about this, keep an eye open for what this thing was. And let's see whether it was related to other disruption we've seen around certainly south of the border and around the world.
Susan, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your insights and appreciate all the good work that you've been doing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
In communities across the province, voters had their say on Monday as to who would lead their municipal governments. Our Ontario Hub's journalists were watching the races and join us now on notable results from their regions. They are in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Charnel Anderson, who covers the northwest of the province; in Hamilton, Ontario, Justin Chandler, who covers the Hamilton-Niagara region; and here in our studio, Kat Eschner, our affordability journalist based out of the GTA. Welcome to everyone.
Hi, Dan.
Thank you.
All right, Justin, I'm going to come to you. Hamilton had a lot of change this election. Of course, a new mayor at the helm, but I'm hoping you can give us a bit of a recap on that municipality.
Absolutely. So it was a barn burner of a mayoral race. Results were very close throughout the night. It ended up being that former MPP and NDP leader in Ontario, Andrew Horwath, beat out the former president and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, Keenan Loomis, by fewer than 2,000 votes. So it was a really close race. And it really seemed to generate a lot of energy in the city among people who were following and getting out to vote. As well, we had 6 incumbents on council not running for our 15-seat council, and 3 incumbents were unseated. So there's 9 new councillors now in the city. So with a new mayor and 9 new councillors, that is really a significant amount of change. And it looks like there's going to be a lot of new, fresh faces and new ideas on city council.
All right, let's move to Niagara region. A lot of municipalities at play there. 4 new mayors were voted in. How does that change or not change things in the region there?
Well, I think it'll depend on how all the policies and the councils shake out as well. But we've got a new mayor in St. Catharines, where the incumbent mayor did not run, and incumbent mayors were beat by pretty wide margins in Niagara-on-the-Lake and in West Lincoln. We also had a very close race. Wainfleet was decided by 12 votes, and a new mayor was elected.
All right, Kat, I'm going to come to you. Premier Ford has given both Toronto and Ottawa, of course, the mayors there strong powers. I want to talk in terms of the lens of affordability, specifically in Toronto. John Tory, elected for his 3rd term. What does that mean for the city?
For sure. Well, I think the first thing to think about when you're thinking about the strong mayor powers, the headline is to be determined. These powers haven't even come into full force yet, and they won't until November. For John Tory, he's already started to discuss what he's going to do with his strong mayor powers. He had a press conference on Wednesday where he was talking about rearranging some of the civil service, so the municipal civil service, which is something he can do under these powers, to create a new housing department that will help deal with Toronto's flourishing housing crisis. I think that when we're thinking about John Tory and housing, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that building more supply, which is what the province has said that they want Toronto and they want other municipalities to do in the next, until 2030, so in the next few years, is only part of the picture. You know, we've talked about this before, I think, but, you know, housing affordability, so it really doesn't matter how many homes you have if nobody can afford them. The other thing about housing with John Tory and about affordability generally is I think, like, to solve some of these problems, to work on some of these problems is going to require a real high degree of diplomacy, especially with the new, more left-leaning council, who Tory hasn't traditionally had these sort of alliances with. And it's also going to require a high degree of vision. I'm not sure that we can say that John Tory has shown these things yet as mayor. And, maybe in his third term with these new powers, this is something he's going to be displaying. So that's part of it. The other part is it's worth noting that he might be a strong mayor. He is still going to have to answer to council.
Right.
Council is still part of the equation for Tory. And as he starts to deal with some of these sort of headline affordability issues like housing, he's going to have to think a lot about how to work with them.
All right, let's travel east on the 401. Let's go to Ottawa. Different story there, a new face. Mark Sutcliffe replaces Jim Watson there. When we talk about affordability in that city, what do we need to see? In
terms of strong mayor, so Ottawa has the same affordability, like this, everywhere has these affordability issues to some degree or another. Ottawa has, they have housing problems, they have affordable food issues, like they have the same kinds of issues. And some of the issues we talked about last time I was on in terms of how municipal elections can affect affordability all apply here. However, Mark Sutcliffe, like the people he was running with, has said he will not use the strong mayor powers at all. And I think, I was kind of wondering to what degree this has to do with some kind of antipathy that maybe Ottawa is feeling towards the provincial government right now after the Freedom Convoy. Right. I think that might be part of the equation, but I think in general, Ottawa voters are much more suspicious of these powers. Mark Sutcliffe, now he said he's not going to use them, but 4 years, a term is a long time, and perhaps he will have occasion to use them. Certainly, affordability issues are something that people are really being pushed to the brink on right now. So if he was to use them, we could maybe anticipate that he might use them. Again, I don't know this, but we can maybe anticipate that he might use them to address, housing or some other affordability-related issue that is within his jurisdiction.
All right, we'll have to see on that one. Charnel, I'm going to come to you. Not necessarily a new face, but an old face that has come back to a seat that he's quite familiar with. Former Mayor Ken Boshkoff reclaimed his seat in Thunder Bay. Was that surprising at all?
I mean, yes and no. Ken Boshkoff, as you say, he has experience. He was mayor. Excuse me. Ken Boshkoff has experience. He was mayor from 1997 to 2003. Before that, he was a city councillor for many years. And afterwards, he was elected MP in Thunder Bay Rainy River. And his political experience was really something that he emphasized in his campaign. And, I would have to say that that's something voters seem to appreciate. Though Gary Mack, who has no formal political experience, he served 2 years as the executive director at Shelter House. He ran his first campaign this election, and he ended up roughly 1,400 votes behind Ken Boshkoff. So Gary Mack really got a lot of support despite a lack of experience. But, Ken Boshkoff knows the ropes. Even though it's been 20 years since he was mayor, he has a sense of how the system works. And that seems to really have tipped the scale in his favor.
All right, I'm going to stick with you, Charnel. You also spoke to a former councillor, Rebecca Johnson, about her thoughts overall on the election. What were her impressions?
So Rebecca Johnson was a city councillor for almost 20 years, and she decided not to run again in this election. But, she was out in the community talking to people. And what she heard from the people she talked to was that they wanted change, complete change. And some change was inevitable because 5 council members, including Rebecca, were not running again. But when the results came in, residents or voters voted back in all of the incumbents. Rebecca had said if she was running, she probably would have been voted back in again as well. So, maybe it goes back to the experience incumbents have. Maybe it goes back to seeing familiar names on the ballot. But I think it's fair to say that, the appetite for change wasn't really as strong as people were saying.
All right, I want to talk about I think, what's potentially the real story here in this municipal election. I'm curious whether or not you were surprised or not. I want to come to you, Justin. Voter turnout. Low across the province. We're talking in the mid-30s to the low 20s in some parts. Were you surprised, and how did that play in your particular regions?
I was surprised in part. I mean, we know that this has been the trend for quite a while to have this low turnout at the municipal level. But in Hamilton, for example, where there was so much excitement about the race among people who were following it, I really thought that turnout would be higher than the 35% or so that it ended up being. Really, there was a ton of excitement, but fewer than 4 in 10 people actually showed up to the polls. And so, there's this desire for change, but we're was everybody really that engaged in wanting to get out? I don't know. It's a lot harder to say. In Niagara, the highest turnout was at 47.79%, and that was in Niagara-on-the-Lake, where a new mayor was elected. But we also saw some very low turnout in the 20s even. And I mean, I thought Thorold was an interesting case. I'd talked to the clerk there about their first outing with online voting. People had many days ahead of the election to vote online, which seemed like that would be something that would be accessible. Maybe a lot of people would take advantage of, and only about a quarter of people actually voted. So it really did seem like in a lot of races, whether there was change or not, people were not terribly engaged. Certainly fewer than half of people showed up to the polls.
Charnel, I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, so I mean, voter turnout in northwestern Ontario was, I would say, relatively high compared to our neighbors in the south. It's not, insanely high, but for example, in Kenora, it was 53%. Red Lake, 61% of voters came out. Dryden, it was 43%. 52% of voters turned out in Pickle Lake, 49% in Fort Francis. It was quite a bit lower in Sioux Lookout at 33%. But here in Thunder Bay, it was just over 42%, which is down from 2018 when it was around 51%. But it is in line with the turnout for the provincial election earlier this year, which was also over 42%. So, the populations are typically lower in this region, but the voter turnout seems to be a little bit higher.
All right, Kat, you get the final word on this. Any surprises on voter turnout, and how did this play out in other parts?
Well, I don't think there are any surprises on voter turnout. Unfortunately, voter turnout for municipal elections tends to be the lowest, which is a really long trend. I can't fully account for that. What I can tell you is that the issues at the municipal level are super important, and they're super important to people's everyday lives. The last time I was on, we discussed how much municipalities can actually affect. So even if people who were watching this didn't make it to the polls, I would encourage them to participate politically in other ways for the next 4 years, and then go next time.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Kat, Justin, Charnel, thank you so much for joining me on the program.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
The agenda this week debated whether the time had come to negotiate with Russia to end the war in Ukraine, assess the merits of so-called Finfluencers on social media, and asked if aiming for smart cities was a wise goal. The agenda's week in review begins examining the state of Canadian federalism.
That initial document, the Free Alberta Strategy, talked about ignoring federal court decisions, and it talked about invalidating federal laws. Since then, Ms. Smith has climbed down, and so now we're waiting to see, and it sounds like we won't find out until after she's elected. She's currently running for her seat in Brooks in a rural riding, and sounds like we won't actually get to see the details of what she's proposing and whether or not it is in fact something significant, or if it's really just sort of more angry letter writing. But I think it's really important to point out that not a lot of people understand just how radical the proposal was, that it essentially did suggest that the legislature, not the courts, but the legislature would decide which laws are constitutional and which ones aren't. And I want to say also this idea of creative non-compliance or creative non-enforcement, I think there's an important distinction has to be made between not assisting the federal government in enforcing its priorities and trying to prohibit the enforcement of those policies and laws, right? And that's where the Sovereignty Act really gets into a bad space, and I think similar with the Saskatchewan proposal, because there have been suggestions at times that it would not just be about not assisting, as we see, for instance, playing out with the gun buyback sort of policy right now, but rather also prohibiting, right? So that, for instance, that the Impact Assessment Act, Bill C-69, would not apply magically within Alberta, or that we wouldn't have to pay a carbon price within Alberta, right? So not just not assisting in enforcement, but actively trying to prohibit or somehow interfere with enforcement. And that, of course, is totally offside. And she can't do that. The Premier Smith can't do that and stay within the bounds of our current constitutional order.
Well, let's see what John Ibbotson from the Globe and Mail had to say about all of this. And to that end, I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to put up a graphic of his recent writings about this. Here's John Ibbotson in the Globe. Progressives across the country have every reason to support the Trudeau government's record of new social and environmental programs. With more action coming on housing, what's not to like? Setting aside the fact these programs have contributed to record deficits and increased government debt, there is the cost to national unity. Aggressive federalism takes its toll. Aggressive federalism. Renaud, come on in on this and tell us whether you believe it is, in fact, the federal government's so-called aggressive federalism that is pushing the prairie provinces to these moves.
Oh, absolutely. And I would say it's not just the prairie provinces. I mean, we're feeling tensions when it comes to the equalization program in Newfoundland. We're seeing a sort of alliance against the carbon tax that we saw with New Brunswick, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Quebec, and Manitoba, and Ontario working on the same court case. So there's a lot of issues where Ottawa's tendency to centralize everything in Ottawa at the expense of the provinces has created this sort of anger and tensions in various areas of the country. I think now it's showing its head much more publicly out west with Western alienation, with these proposals. But it's by no means over in Quebec. The same sort of issues are still there in Quebec, and Quebec still wants to be respected as part of the federation. And it goes to show that when the federal government sort of tries to impose itself into areas of provincial jurisdictions. We've seen it with healthcare. We've seen it with childcare. We are now seeing it with dental care. We're seeing it with the Impact Assessment Act. It's progressively eroding the level of trust that the provinces have in the federal government as an equal partner.
I just heard Nathalie Desrosiers say under her breath, no.
What do you mean?
That is this inherent in the federalism structure that you will have aggressive decision-making or aggressive legislation being pushed forward, taking the vacuum, So taking the lead on childcare may actually support and respect provinces actually making their own deal. So there always was a tension in Canadian federalism between the centralization being kind of forward-looking, social investment, environment protection being a good example of how important it is to have probably a national policy if you're serious about climate change. But, and then at the same time being what we called the laboratory of provincial policymaking that actually emulate each other or push a little further, and some provinces will be ahead of others and will be ahead of the federal government. It does create, I agree with Renaud, it's inherent that there's tensions. It's been like this since 1867.
Mm-hmm. Howard, how about you on that Ibbotson quote? Do you think aggressive federalism is what's prompted some of this?
I absolutely think it's prompted some of this, and a couple of examples have been mentioned already. One is C-69, the Impact Assessment Act. That is an example where the federal government was very high-handed in exercising its jurisdiction over environment, which we should remember is a shared constitutional jurisdiction, but it used its powers to claim jurisdiction over projects that are entirely within a single province, and Alberta pushed back on that, and they actually won. The Alberta Court of Appeal declared some aspects of that law unconstitutional. We'll see how that goes up to the Supreme Court. But that's a clear example of high-handed federal government policy, where even the Senate, with a Liberal-appointed majority at the time, recommended to the government that it amend that legislation to remove some of those more egregious intrusions onto provincial jurisdiction. And the federal government just ignored the Senate. And another is childcare. I mean, the recent childcare is one of those examples of what's called cooperative federalism, where I think a lot of provinces, including Alberta, were asking cooperation, but cooperation on the federal government's terms is all that's being offered. And so, I mean, a one-size-fits-all or even a margin of provincial, negotiation being permitted, it's just wholly constitutionally inappropriate. I mean, this is a clear area of provincial jurisdiction. There's no way the federal government could legislate in this area, and yet they try and legislate indirectly by attaching conditions to these transfers, which are not federal money, particularly in a case of a province like Alberta. This is money that's taxed. The tax base is coming from Alberta. It goes through Ottawa, it goes back, and comes back with conditions. And when those conditions are in an area of core provincial jurisdiction, that's absolutely inappropriate. And I think the provinces are right to push back and say this is none of your business.
Well, but in a way, the federal spending power, and that's what we're talking about, there is always a question. It's been for a long time about whether you could impose conditions or not on the money. The money is being taxed across Canada. It's not coming from Alberta. It comes from the taxpayers, and it goes to the federal government, and then it says, if you want my money, you're going to have to obey by conditions. And people fight back, and I agree with you. It has been an irritant for a long time. Yeah.
You say my money as though it's the federal government's money, and I would push back and say no, it's not. This is money that is collected by the federal government, but the fact that the government collects the money is not of constitutional significance, or shouldn't be, and shouldn't allow it then to interfere in areas of provincial jurisdiction. And I think this is an area where the provinces are actually starting to say, this may have been the way we've done it for 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years, but
we're going to.
Yeah, let's quote, draw the line, this discussion was.
Nearly 8 months into this war, is it time to start negotiating with Putin for a potential end to this war? George Beebe, start us off, please.
Yes, I think it is time to start negotiating with Putin on this. You know, President Biden a few weeks ago warned that we were on course toward a direct U.S.-Russian military conflict. He worried about what Putin might do if he's cornered. And I think he was right to worry about that. We're headed toward that kind of direct collision. And that's a very dangerous thing. And I think the only way you get out of that escalatory spiral is by talking. That's the way that Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, almost exactly 60 years ago. And that's what I think we need to do today.
Melinda Herring, your view.
Steve, it's not time yet, and it's up to the Ukrainians. So George and I are longtime debate partners, and I have the same problem with his statement that I always have with his statements. Ukraine has agency, and Ukraine gets to decide when it wants to negotiate. And the Ukrainians are not interested in negotiating, and the Russians are not interested in negotiating at this point.
Medea Benjamin.
The Russians are certainly interested in negotiating. I think they're desperate to negotiate. And I think the U.S. has a lot to say in this, because without U.S. weapons, the Ukrainians would not be able to put up this kind of fight. I think it's totally irresponsible that President Biden is not talking to Putin, that Secretary Blinken is not talking to Lavrov. The time is not only now, the time was long, many months ago. It should have happened before the war started, when the U.S. dismissed Russia's entreaty to negotiate, and it should happen immediately. Otherwise, we're in a lose-lose situation for the whole world.
Colonel Kansian.
Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be any common ground between the two sides. The Ukrainians want to reclaim all of their territory. Not surprisingly, the Russians haven't shown any indication of a willingness to withdraw. And once you start negotiations, you build an expectation that you're about to make a deal, that there's a deal on the table, you just have to find it. The only deal that you could make right now is an in-place ceasefire, and that gives Russia about 18% of Ukraine.
Okay, thank you for those statements. We now know where the four of you stand on this issue, and let's follow up. George, do you believe, I mean, I understand that you think we should be talking, but do you believe that there are the makings of a potential deal right now that both sides could sign on to?
Well, it depends on how you view the shape of some sort of deal. If you're talking about a territorial settlement where Ukraine and Russia agree on where the borders of Ukraine will be drawn, then no, there's no prospect of some sort of settlement on that anytime soon. That's a zero-sum deal. One side will win, one side will lose to some degree. And I don't think there's any interest on either side in finding that kind of a compromise right now. But that's not what we should be talking about. We need to be talking about the U.S.-Russian strategic relationship, how we each can avoid a head-on military collision that has potentially catastrophic implications for everyone involved in this, including the entire world. That's something that Ukraine doesn't get to decide. We should not be outsourcing American national security to Kiev. The United States and Russia need to be talking about how we handle that issue. And that's something that I think can be done. I think the Russians want to talk about that. And the question of where Ukraine's borders are going to be delineated can be handled over time, over a long time. That's how the Baltic states were handled during the Cold War. The United States never recognized the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. We never have to recognize Russian annexation of any Ukrainian territory.
Okay, let me get some feedback. Let's get some feedback from some of the other guests on that position. Melinda Herring, okay, they're not going to agree on borders, but talks should still be had because of the broader U.S.-Russian geostrategic potential partnership. What do you say to that?
So, Steve, the White House is talking to Moscow. It is false to say that they're not talking. Biden has been very, very clear about nuclear weapons. He said that there will be catastrophic consequences if they're used. And the White House has told the Kremlin what we will do if Vladimir Putin uses nuclear weapons, and he's been very, very clear about that. So it's false to say that we are not talking. George is playing my favorite game. He's trying to distract us with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons and a peace deal are two very different things. I think the nuclear threat is serious, but I would assess it at a 5% chance. George would probably assess it higher. I won't put words in his mouth. But I think the White House has done a very good job of taking the threat seriously. Bottom line, Putin's not going to use nukes, and I'm glad to explain why.
The regulation is coming on the whole online, education, Finfluencer marketplace. Australia's led the way for a couple of years now, included in the regulation of their licensed financial advisor marketplace. UK, USA, Canada is a bit slower on this. And I think part of what's also good to appreciate is even in the regulated licensed world I'm operating in, mortgages are licensed and regulated different than insurance, which is licensed and regulated different than investment products. Within investment products, there's different licenses, different regulations, different requirements. And in the middle is general financial advice that's largely unregulated. So if you want to talk about goals and cash flow and saving for retirement, really, even in the regulated world, not a lot of people supervising or watching over that. So it's even more complicated because it depends on, in Canada, what type of advice you're giving. They're all in different pages. The provinces are even different to some degree. But regulation's coming because even in the license channel, something just came out a few months ago where they're now looking at titles of financial advisors in Ontario. So what I put on my business card, next up's going to be credentials. What do all those credentials mean? I've got 8 credentials. And if one of them was fake on my business card, you'd never know. They're not, but I'm just saying, you'd never know. So there's a lot of work to do, both in the regulated channel, and this is just added in, it's coming too. So if you want to get ahead of it, because they can literally shut you down if you don't kind of follow these rules over time.
Cavell, let's hear from you on this. Is this coming to Canada, and should it?
I think it's definitely on its way. Like Kurt mentioned, Australia is a leader in that they've regulated titles for who can call themselves a financial planner or financial advisor for a few years now, and Canada's in the process of doing that, which is fantastic. Definitely agree. And I do believe that there needs to be some regulation, at least in terms of, like we said, what kind of disclaimers are you putting on your online video to indicate, I'm being paid by such and such company to recommend this product to you, or again, making this investment recommendation because it worked for me, but it's not actually advice. Please go do your own research and talk to your financial advisor. So I definitely think it's on its way, and I think it's a good thing.
Jim, what say you?
I totally agree. So I think if you're giving advice on social media that seems questionable, like it's not education, it's not inspiration, it kind of borders, like you're talking about a stock, you're talking about a ETF, you should make a disclaimer very clear to say that this is not advice. You should consult your financial advisor, or some kind of disclaimer like that for sure. I put that everywhere on my social media channels, and it's important. But the fact is, 99% of people on TikTok, on the new platforms, they don't worry about that stuff, and that's a big problem. So one of the benefits of social media is that you get a lot of access to information, but 99% of that information, I would say, is harmful.
Do you, Siobhan, you want the government regulating what you put up on your website?
I think it should be regulated if it's in the best interest of the people, because I think within each of our different businesses, people are at the heart of it, and we're trying to help them. And so if institutions and companies like TikTok and Instagram can also take responsibility for ensuring that we are doing the best we can and legally, then I think that's a great step to helping us all make sure that we have a level of discernment when it comes to consuming social media.
Okay, let's do, you know, Jim, I want to talk to you about Logan Paul. I got to confess, I didn't know who Logan Paul was before doing this. The so-called mega influencer, Logan Paul. You guys all know who he is?
Yes.
Sort of.
You all know who he is. Okay. All right. Anyway, he promoted some obscure cryptocurrency called Dink Doink. You ever heard of this?
Yeah.
Yeah? Am I like totally out of it here? Yeah, a little bit. Okay, Dink Doink I hadn't heard of before doing the research for this. He's got 6 million followers and he's promoting it to them, but he didn't disclose, apropos of what you said about Kardashian, didn't disclose an important conflict of interest. He was friends with the creator of the crypto coin, and they'd come up with this idea together, and then the price of Dink Doink plummets, and he finds himself in hot water. So the question, okay, Jim, come on in this. How common is bad cryptocurrency advice in the Finfluencer world?
I think it's rampant. Like last year when I was on TikTok, almost everything in my feed was on promoting a coin or promoting an NFT or promoting something related to
NFT,
cryptocurrency.
that's another one. Hang on, I think I might know this one. Non-fungible token? Okay.
Correct. So that was everywhere. And it was really bad advice. It was very damaging. But the voice and the interest and the hype around it was so big, it was almost inevitable that no one, including regulators, could keep up with it, and a lot of people got hurt. And it's a danger. That's exactly why it's dangerous to listen to social media when it comes to different asset classes and treating it like advice.
We're going to talk about smart cities.
Sure.
I need you to define what they are.
Well, a smart city is kind of a buzzword when we're thinking about like what the realm of possibility of what technology could do for us. In like 2007, 2008, these new things called smartphones were suddenly just in everyone's pockets, and people were thinking, well, what could be smart next? And this group of companies, you know, Siemens, Cisco, IBM, wanted to sort of rewire cities and get things like central command centers to really, you know, kind of make cities a little bit more efficient from like the way that they're run. That did not necessarily go over well. There were a lot of cost overruns, a few controversies, places like Songdo in South Korea. It was not necessarily a sort of a great, you know, successor to the smartphone. And then in sort of the mid-2010s, 7 or 8 years later, there was sort of the social media world, and those sort of companies started thinking, well, what can we do for cities? Specifically with this company called Sidewalk Labs that wanted to build a city from the internet up by thinking about cities from what can we do, you know, for people? What can we really make the sidewalk itself a lab? And think about how can we, you know, embed technologies to make life better for everyday people. But is there such a thing as a smart city? Not necessarily, because no one's really ever actually built one in a successful way that's been celebrated as, you know, something that has made life better for people.
So Vas, what would it look like sort of on the ground? If you lived in a smart city or a smart neighborhood, you would therefore what?
Well, I guess if we think of smart cities in that binary way, that you're either a smart city or you're not, that's where it kind of falls down, right? Because what we're pointing to is the application, targeted application of particular technologies that are meant to enhance our civic life, manage traffic better, manage garbage disposal better, help kind of flow people through a city, try to learn from everything that's going on inside a city to make cities arguably better, more efficient, better run. So what would it mean if we were living in one? I mean, ideally, you wouldn't necessarily know. Not in the sense that it's deceptive, but everything would be better. A little bit smoother.
Got it. As you look at a map of the world, can you point to a dot anywhere that says, oh, that's a smart city? They're doing all of those things.
Well, there are, I mean, as Josh mentioned, there are places that self-describe as smart cities, like Songdo, South Korea, and there are cities that have invested a lot of money in these technologies. But I think that the thing about the smart city label is that it's actually quite constrained, and what cities are is much bigger than that, much more complicated and more resilient to and defiant about the imposition of a set of technologies. And so I think that that's why it's difficult to actually say, okay, well, this is a great working example.
Does the idea appeal to you, though?
I think that it's an overly narrow set of solutions to the nature of urban life, right? It's I was in Mexico City a couple of weeks ago. It's 22 million people. There are an incredible number of things going on all at the same time. It's a very vibrant place, and I was walking around thinking, there's no way that you could actually kind of come up with an inventory of technologies that manage that space. And, that's a good thing, I think.
You prefer the sort of more organic way of
Yeah,
work.
I believe in the notion of messy urbanism, and that it's that cities were not meant to be kind of managed in a rational way like that.
Vast, does the notion of a smart city appeal to you, generally speaking?
Elements of a smarter city certainly appeal to me. And I think we hear that from citizens now and then, but not always articulated in that way. So for instance, with something like speed cameras that we're starting to get used to, we have expectations that this will be a more kind of efficient, effective application of, equitably penalizing people who speed in certain areas. And then as we learn more about them, we realize that they come with additional costs. There's a human element to this. We have to send tickets within 30 days. Sometimes these are turned off. So, the idea that a technological intervention is a substitute for governance, oversight, humans for people in some way, I think that's where it falls apart. Would I like to be able to have my Presto card on my phone so that when I lose it, things like that? Like, is that a smart city, or is that just a smarter use of technologies that sort of help us get around? I think that's maybe where we can get tripped up in some of the conversation. That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, October 28th, 2022. On Monday, musician and author Tom Wilson and his daughter join us to talk about his life, finding family, and the new documentary that profiles him called Beautiful Scars. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a terrific weekend, and we'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.